I messed that up already. That's fantastic. I started just before it started, so I'll try it again. Yeah, that's fantastic. Welcome to First in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write better fiction, and this is what you get when Steve is not with us. So, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Alton Gansky, author of the Hand of Adonai series, The Bargain, and First in Fiction. Joining us today, we have my father, Alton Gansky. Say hi, Dad.
Hi, Dad.
There you go. That's fantastic.
It's good to be with you again, Aaron.
Yeah, and joining us also we have Maya Goode. Maya, why don't you say hi and tell us a little bit about yourself?
As you said, my name is Maya Goode, and I am a new writer, but I'm working on finishing my first novel, and I come at writing from a slightly different perspective. I'm obsessed with character development. I spent most of my childhood through late teens doing serious amounts of method acting, and I studied psychology in undergrad, and I pretty much came out of undergrad thinking I was going to go on and do a PhD and realized that would much rather put my psychology curiosity into books. So that's what I do.
Awesome. Awesome. And Dad, why don't you remind us tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm the author of about 43 books. One or two of them are pretty good. And been a full-time writer for a while now. And that's pretty much it. My latest book's nonfiction. My next book is also nonfiction, though most of my writing has been novels, 27, 28 novels, something like that. And so I kind of work both sides of the fence there, doing fiction and nonfiction, book-length work.
Yeah, and I'm slowly catching up with you. So at this rate, maybe another 30 years or so, I'll be caught up, maybe.
Well, I'm slowing down and getting old, so.
Yeah, I was going to say, as long as you stop writing. So, I thought today we'd talk a little bit about character psychology, and it's something that originally I didn't pay much attention to, but the more I write, the more I find myself investing in these types of things, is learning the psychology behind my characters and ensuring that my characters are consistent with their personality types, their thought processes, etc. And I also like to try and create a few surprises. I try and have my characters do a couple things that will surprise even them. And so I'm not going to say that I'm the expert at this at all, because I don't know much about psychology other than what I can Google. So Maya, if you don't mind, why don't you tell us a little bit about the process you go through when you're planning your character psychology and how that plays out for you kind of on the page?
Well, it's pretty funny because I have like 4 abandoned novels that got to 30,000 words, and I was never able to really progress until this last novel. And I think what really made the difference was I tapped into some of the exercises I did when I did acting, when I was developing the characters. And so a lot of people say they can't outline because they need to be able to discover, the story. They need to have that time to discover the characters. Well, as part of my outlining process, I actually did that work ahead of time. And so in addition to a regular outline, I had character outlines that chronicled their history, their goals, but also the actual emotional growth pattern and change in their personality that they will go through throughout the course of the book. And so in addition to beats being like, okay, at this section, at, this scene, this particular thing needs to happen, I also had outlines that said, at this particular scene, this is the emotion that my character is feeling, and this is why. And I think being much more in touch with my character's emotional side is what's made it to the point where I know this book is going to get finished. Now, as part of that process, this is going to sound a little weird. When I did acting, we had these exercises where we would close our eyes and we would meditate on our character, what they did, what their past was like, what emotions they were feeling, and we would take our own historical emotions and magnify them until they could approximate what our characters were feeling. And then we would do interviews or monologues in character. I actually did this in preparation for my book, and so I spent a lot of time in the shower or in front of a recording device talking as if I was my character. And by doing that, I was able to develop a voice and be able to identify who they were as people. It made them a lot more real, and it made it easier for me to write in their voice.
Wow, very cool. I've done similar things, maybe not the acting aspect, but the character interviews. I've done that in the monologues. I've never actually recorded them though. That's a very interesting thing, trying to adopt the voice of the character. I've never actually considered that. Pops, how do you handle it when you're going into a book or a novel, and possibly even with the nonfiction versus the fiction? How do you handle that? Do you research the psychology of the people that you're writing about in your nonfiction? And does that kind of translate into your fiction in any way?
Well, it depends on the topic of the nonfiction book. The most recent book, 60 People Who Shaped the Church, I did that a fair amount depending on who the person was. For example, Martin Luther had a pretty rough childhood, and his parents were abusive, and that later affects him when he becomes a monk, about how he treats himself. And so we see part of that internal struggle and that emotion with that. The fiction's a little different. I am an intuitive writer, a discovery writer, and I know that these elements need to be there, but I prefer to get to know the character, and the character will often surprise me, and then I begin to realize what's going on. So for me, the characters become very real. And I've caught myself wondering about how they're doing and things like that, because they've begun to populate my mind. So I do take a little different approach to it. I'm keenly aware that there is some psychology going on there, but I'm trying to discover their psychology. And one reason I do that, and this is not to say the other way is wrong, it's not. It's whatever way you do it to get the job done is what's important, as long as you get the elements in there. But for me, when I'm writing, I want to be like the reader. I want to discover some of this stuff, and so this stuff will be revealed in stages throughout the book.
Yeah, I like that. I find myself often discovering the psychology of my character somewhere in the final chapter or two, and then there leads up to being quite a bit of rewrites and revision in that process of discovery. But Maya, I was going to ask you a couple quick questions, and just, these are very broad, kind of sweeping questions, and I'm sure you've spent years studying this kind of stuff, but nature versus nurture, I guess, is one of the primary questions that I was wondering about. My dad mentioned Martin Luther's background, his childhood, and how that shaped him as an adult. How do our characters' backgrounds shape them, and how much of that actually plays into a character's psychology versus, say, genetics?
For me, I can always tell when an author has done that work. I'm actually reading a very famous novel right now that I'm having a hard time getting through because the characters don't have a really solid and realistic psychology backing them up. From what I have learned and from what I have observed in people, I'm also a bartender, so I spend all of my work time watching people and eavesdropping and often taking notes when they're not looking. And so
have another drink. What were you saying now?
Yeah, exactly.
Photos, secret recording.
Exactly. What I enjoy is exploring the intersection of nature and nurture. I have a copy of the DSM, and I remember the first day in Psych 101, and we were gonna, literally, it was our textbook for the semester, and the first thing the professor said was, don't diagnose yourself, because everything in this book everybody has. What makes you sick is if it's affecting your life. And then the second thing he said was, the first half of the book are mood disorders. Those are chemical. Those have to do with your brain. The second half of the book is personality disorders. Those are the disorders that are raised. Those are the disorders that come from your family. And so when I actually use a little bit of my DSM sometimes, when I run into character traits, I'm like, this character, there's a quirk here, but I don't know what it is. I might look in there and see, what kind of thing might they have a touch of here and there, and how would that work with their family? So, for example, my main character right now, he's a first-generation immigrant. His mother was an immigrant from Tibet during the revolution. And so, looking at character psychology, he's first-generation immigrant. He's got a little bit of tug and pull between being a little bit too much like his mother and being a little bit too westernized. And so he's not quite comfortable in his own skin. And as I'm writing, there are little things that pop up, like the fact that he has a ton of crap in his apartment that he can't get rid of. He has a hard time throwing things away. That comes from being raised with someone who lost everything when she was little. And there's a touch of hoarder in there, okay? Just a touch. Or if someone has been abused, you can go all out and do like the total stereotypical abused woman scenario. Sometimes that's not very interesting. It's much more interesting to see someone who is abused and who seems to be functioning, but every once in a while it creeps out here or there. And like you said, I have the outline of their emotional trajectory, but they still surprise me along the way. There are still things that pop up. I was writing earlier, and one of the things I do is I actually like to write in character when I'm writing from a certain person's point of view. I like to get in character before I start writing. And when I do that, those are times that those kind of revelations come up. Those are times when the inner fears start to connect the dots. And I do find that really interesting. Having a basic understanding of childhood development, basic understanding of lifetime personality development, I found is very crucial, especially if you're working with characters who are different ages. Someone who is younger, the frontal lobe may not have developed completely yet, and so they're going to be they're going to be much more compulsive, much more likely to have certain traits, not negative traits. It's just their brain is still developing in certain ways, and that does affect their personality a little bit. And that same person at 30 is going to be a very different person as they've gone through life and had life experiences. And then typically you see a lot of people, like my grandmother, like many people's grandmothers, who was a pain in the butt at 50, 60, 70, and as they got older, they calmed down a little bit, they learned to stop stressing, their kids are out of the house, and that comes through as well. And so having an idea of what those patterns are and what can affect those patterns, what can throw them off kilter, I find makes it much more interesting when you're creating a character, because then you can create someone that's fully fleshed out rather than a one-dimensional character. I want the quirks, I want the surprises, I want the moods, I want there to be something behind them.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple things, and I'm going to butcher this quote, and I apologize in advance, but there's that famous saying that every family is unhappy in their own way. And when you talk about this idea of the stereotypical background of the person who's abused, and we oftentimes will come up with a character who's got kind of a shady past, and perhaps they are a victim of abuse. And we tend I tend to see a lot of beginning writers forming very stereotypical kind of drunk father kind of mentality, or whatever the case may be. And it's hard to get behind those characters in the sense that it seems so stock and so cliche. It doesn't seem real. It doesn't feel real. And so finding the particular details of exactly how that family was unhappy, I think, is really important. And it kind of reminds me, Pops, a little bit of something that you mentioned, and you can correct me here if I'm wrong, but I seem to remember that at one of the books that you wrote, you had a character pretty much just walk out of the novel. Did you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I did. She was not necessarily a very nice person in one of the scenes I was creating. There came a confrontation between her and the protagonist, and I remember pacing around and asking, okay, what would she do? I knew what the others would do, and so, but what would this one person do? And the answer was she would knock him on his fanny and walk out, which she did, but it left me one character short. And at the time, I didn't know what I was going to do. I was able to bring an auxiliary character in who had appeared several times, so it was natural to bring that person in. And only later did I realize that she was the solution to the overall problem. She would be the means of safety, the means of salvation for a situation it was an ensemble cast for the rest of the cast. Had she not walked out, she would not have been available. She would not have been the hero, she would have been the victim with that. But at the time I was doing that, I had no idea. I just knew that I had to keep consistent with how I had written her to this point, with her personality, her set of emotions, and then be true to that. And it put me in a bind for a while because I couldn't come up with another solution other than the one I had. But then later, as an intuitive writer, I discovered these things along the way. I began to understand why that had to happen in that story.
What struck me about what you just said was, by following the natural, really truthful instincts of that character, you were able to find solutions, possibly solution to a problem that you didn't even know you had.
Right.
And when I started writing my book, I did what a lot of new writers do. I focused all my character development time on my main character. Did development on everybody else, but not near as much. right at around 35,000 words, right, I came to a screeching halt, and I was like, I can't go anywhere. I don't know what's wrong. And I stopped writing for 2 weeks, and I realized what it was I hadn't developed my second and third character well enough. And I sat down and I redid some of their development, went back, reintroduced my second character, realized I wanted to introduce her earlier. I needed to introduce her in a way that had nothing to do with the main character at all, have her as a completely separate person. And then all of a sudden the problem like solved itself because I was again writing in a much more truthful way.
You know, I like what you're saying, and that's one thing that I'm noticing a lot. I mentor writers, and one of the things that I see consistently, both from my students and from the writers that I mentor, is oftentimes a lack, maybe not in the consistency of the character, but in the interactions of the characters and the motivations. And I see this a lot with outline writers who, and not, again, I don't mean to pick on them, but
no, it's fine.
They tend to say, I want my character to go from point A to point B, from point B to point C, but they know that because they know, well, at point B this has to happen, at point C this has to happen, but they don't put in enough time to consider why the character is going to go from point A to point B, from point B to point C, what they're going to actually do in point B, how they actually feel at point B, the decisions that they're actually going to make. And oftentimes, a mantra I find myself asking my mentors, or my mentees rather, is, why is your character doing this? Why don't they simply do this? This is the easiest solution. This is the most reasonable thing for them to do at this point, but they're not doing it. Why not? And if there's a compelling reason, then fine. But if there's not a compelling reason, then we really need to reevaluate the choices that our characters are making. And that's something that I repeat to those who I mentor, because it's something that my mentors have repeated to me. Why are your characters doing this? This is not how this particular character would think and act. And I noticed it specifically on the bargain. I have a character who is not a believer, who is surrounded by believers, and whenever he had a thought, I had my mentor at the time was not a believer, and whenever he had a thought, he would say, no, this character would not think this way. This would not make sense to your character at this point. And he really challenged me on that, and it was good because from my background, I didn't have the same perception as my character would, and so he challenged me on that. But I also want to talk a little bit about the interactions between characters. You were talking about your secondary characters, your tertiary characters. And in the research that I've been doing, the psychology research and looking at the character psychology of my characters, is that the personality types, the ESTJs and the INTFs, and I can't remember all of them, and you're probably laughing at me right now.
I can't remember all of them either.
Yeah, but they have complements. They have complements, and some that work together, and then some that don't like to be together. And you can create a lot of tension, I think, within your characters from pitting a couple opposite personalities, putting them in the same room, or when you have a romance, the opposites attract, etc. And being able to play on that is I think something that really can benefit our fiction. I don't know if you have something you want to add to that, or Pops, if you have something that you do with your characters to kind of ensure that tension stays alive.
Well, again, this is going to vary from writer to writer. Really, a couple things in the last conversation. In my book, Ship Possessed, I struggled in the beginning. My protagonist, I had down. I just understood that person very, very well. But the secondary character, which you often have when you have a strong leader, sort of the Dr. Watson to Sherlock Holmes and all the other ones that go along with it, there's usually an ancillary character who helps develop the protagonist. And it just wasn't working. This guy was not working out for me. I was a Navy captain and an ensign, and this ensign just was not working out. And then it finally occurred to me, I don't know how many words I was into the thing, 20, 30,000 words, when it occurred to me that the problem is he was not a he was a she. I had assigned the wrong genre. I changed the genre, or as I joke, I gave him a sex change operation, made him into a woman, and all of a sudden it all fell together. My protagonist changed, became different, a more complete individual, gave more motivation, and all of a sudden the whole book came together. But it was because I was missing that one thing, but I could not have anticipated that. I thought I had when I got my cast of characters, and I was just off on this one character for the balance. that the story needed, and then it ended up working out with that. So sometimes
I actually have somebody
you
that's
don't
getting
know.
a sex change.
I'm sorry?
I actually have somebody that's getting a sex change. I think that's interesting.
Yeah. Well, I needed this one done because it was ruining my book. I was having to work too hard. So that sometimes is surprising. And there are people who love to do all this stuff up front, and that's fine. You've heard me say this before, Aaron, is that all that matters is that you get it done. So it doesn't matter if you're intuitive or an outliner. You got to get to the same point one way or the other, and both have advantages and disadvantages. So I know people who do Myers-Briggs, and they'll do entire psychological makeups for the characters, or interview them as one, like they're on a talk show, and they'll write down all the answers and stuff. That doesn't work for me because I don't see the world that way. My brain doesn't process that kind of stuff. I have to experience them. I have to see it. I have to put them in a extraordinary situation and see what they do with it. So a lot of it's a learning process for me. And to go ahead with the genre, I'll just add one other thing. I've done several books where I've had the protagonist was a female. I had a lot of learning to do to make her believable, especially since she's the primary character. So I had to call on a lot of people to guide me because I was making some bad assumptions. And the reverse is true when I've edited other people. But the woman writing a man, they often get it wrong. They imbue all these other emotions and stuff that women can handle deftly, and men just have no idea what they mean. We're just not that deep.
There are definitely some gender, I don't want to say stereotypes, but men and women see the world differently, and I think we need to take that into consideration as well. And it does say something also about their psychology and how they handle things, whether they internalize it or they externalize it, and those types of things. So, on that issue, I know one of the big breakdowns of personality types are the internalizers versus the externalizers. I hope I'm using the correct terms.
You're fine.
Yeah.
When I look at a character, one thing that I want to get clear, because it seems like there's this idea that you're either a pantser or you're an outliner. And in my case, I'm a hybrid of the two. I just do my exploratory writing before I actually start writing my book. So when I'm doing all of this development work, when I'm doing the actual outline, rather than sitting down and just doing a strict outline, I did the Snowflake Method. And I literally have reams of paper that I have just sat and written ideas, thoughts, history, all that stuff ahead of time. So it's not that I have done a strict outline where it's plot-based. It really is on several different levels. It's plot-based, but it's also character-based, it's also goal-based, it's individual. I have parts of my outline where my characters are seeing the same situation differently. And so that's one thing I wanted to get clear, that you don't necessarily have to do one or the other. There are ways to combine the positives of both. Now, as far as the different character types, I've never been one for character typing because I feel like there's so much gray. I feel like people have a lot of similar characteristics, but one thing I've found both in watching people and in my studies is that when you're around different people, different characteristics will come out. So when you're talking to your best friend, you may have a slightly different voice than when you're talking to your girlfriend versus when you're talking to your mother versus when you're talking to your father. And by getting that right, you're making those relationships more real. You're still the same person. You still have the same tone, but there are certain words you may use that are differently. You may talk about the same event slightly differently. And I think a lot of times people get so caught up on their character just being a flat, static event that they miss out on those variations. And those variations, I think, make your character a lot more real. So when I look at character types, I will look at them, but I look at them for ideas. I don't look at them for rules. Like, I don't approach this as this character is an ing whatever, and this character is something else, and when they come together, this is going to happen. Like, I don't look at it that way. I look at it more like, okay, this character is a little introverted and a little afraid of this emotion. This character is coming on a little bit too strong. What's naturally going to happen? He's going to back off. You know, this character is upset and he can't handle his emotions. What's going to happen? Is he going to call his best friend and cry about it? No, he's probably going to sit on the internet and watch porn for a couple hours because, you know, whatever. So these are the types of things that I'm thinking about, you know, rather than just being like a type.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I like the ideas versus rules. That makes a lot of sense. And one of the things, the resources that I've been looking at lately is I think it's just 16personalities.com, which has the breakdown of the different personality types. You can take a personality test. I haven't gone to that extent because I'm partially afraid to know what I am, but I'm afraid I'll break the test. The test will be like, I don't know what to do with you. But at some point, one of the advantages that I like about it is it offers strengths and weaknesses. And you're talking about this idea of dimensionality, character dimensionality, and Stephen James talks about that a lot, character status and dimensionality. And in some places, your character is going to have a high status, and they're going to be a little more authoritative, and they're going to be a little more, kind of have a more domineering type of personality, whereas in other cases, they're going to be more submissive, and they're going to have a lower status. And being able to see that shift in our characters is going to help us understand that, number one, it's going to make them more real. It's going to take them away from being stereotypes as well. Especially when we look at our protagonists, our antagonists, we tend to do a lot of work on our protagonists and neglect our antagonists. So we get, as Steve likes to say, people who are evil for evil's sake. It's like, why are they trying to take over the world? Because they want to take over the world. Well, what has brought them to this point is because, you know, I need somebody to beat up. You know, giving them some history, some psychological history. And I'm going to go a little bit nerd real quick, but when we look at Batman and the villains, we did this whole series on villain, or a whole episode on villains some time ago, but the mental illnesses that they really personify, and how they arrive at, you know, whether it be the megalomania, the schizophrenia, or whatever other diagnosis you want to give them, but they become the embodiment of it, and there's some story that explains how they came to that point. And that's one thing I think that people appreciate about Batman, is that the villains feel, even though they're almost comical caricatures at some point, there's a steadiness to them. There's something solid to them because they have that, like you said, the intersection of nature versus nurture. So I like the way that you say that, absolutely.
Aaron, we have a question from Molly Jo. Molly Jo asks this: who was the most difficult character you've written? That is, A, which character did you have the hardest time developing? And alternately, B, which character didn't want to behave the way you wanted, needed him, her to behave? So, did you have an unruly character?
Who wants to go first?
Well, I keep going back to the example that you gave, Pops, about somebody walking out. I could probably answer that with a little bit more thought. The most unruly character that I've had. For me, I think a lot of it comes from not knowing my characters at the outset and understanding them at the end, and the whole time trying to figure out who my characters are. I remember particularly in the Hand of Adonai series, I was most frustrated with the character of Aiden because he had the least amount of substance to him. He was just kind of, didn't really have a solid history. He was just kind of there to fulfill a role. And one thing that kind of unlocked his character for me was getting toward the end and giving him, I finally heard his voice. And hearing his voice made me understand his personality and how he viewed the world. And I know that sounds kind of obscure, but we know people, and we know the way they speak and the way they say things is indicative of their perception of the world. I wouldn't say that he was unruly, but once I figured out who he was, I was able to go back and really kind of spend a lot more time deepening that character. And I really like how he's come out.
For me, I would say my most difficult character is actually my female in my book right now. And it was because I had the wrong motivations for her. And so everything I was trying to make her do, it wasn't feeling right. And you know, here I have this strong female character. Yes, she has an abusive background. Like if you took, you know, Neruda and Diego Rivera and smushed them together, that's her father. And so she has all this like stuff going on, and she became a poet anyway, even though her father tells her she can't because she's a girl. And here she is, 40-something years old. She's strong, she's independent, she's doing all this stuff. She falls for a younger guy, and I'm like, why is she acting like this total like pushover in the situation? Why isn't she taking control? What is she afraid of? You know, she's sick, she needs treatment, she's refusing. Why? Like, what strong woman would do that? And it took me a really long time to figure out that even with all the abuse at his hand, it had nothing to do with that. She was fine with that. She wasn't traumatized with that. It had to do with her mother. And by being, like you said, a newbie writer and instantly going to the easy thing, instantly going to, you know, of course, you know, she has an abusive background, you know, it must be her father, and totally overlooking this really, like, strong motivation, nothing I was writing was feeling right. And once I recognized that, and that came out in almost an exploratory session where she was talking with her friend and it just came out. And I'm like, oh, that's why none of this made sense. And I was able to go back and fix some things, and it started to make sense, and I recognized that, you know, she's fine with the male characters. Her problems are with other females. And so, you know, by recognizing that, all of a sudden everything kind of smoothed out. My end outline for the last, like, I don't know, 15 scenes completely changed, and everything suddenly made sense. And so, you know, whenever something's really hard, I usually figure out that something's wrong.
How about you, Pops?
That's a tough one. I think maybe in my last novel I have a character. He was difficult to write because I wanted him to be more, but his situation wouldn't allow him to be more early in the book. He's a seminary professor. He's reclusive. He doesn't like to go out. He stays in a dark room all the time. That's because of an event that happened when he was just about to graduate high school and at a key moment in his life. And he is so much stronger than he knows, and that was difficult for me not to put into the book early. Yeah. He had to suffer for a bad decision he made, and the circumstances in it puts him... well, he saw a young girl killed, and he did nothing about it. He tried to, but he was too weak at the time. He ended up running away. Well, this haunts him the rest of his life with that. And then in the course of another set of events as an adult, he has to team up with someone, and it's a police detective, homicide detective, a woman, and it's this young girl's sister. And so now he's terror-stricken all the time. And I wanted him to be more earlier, and I knew he couldn't be. So it was difficult to get into that churning morass of self-loathing, weakness, reclusiveness. Right. And that became kind of a... Well, I'm a writer, so I'm reclusive all the time. Anyway, that part I could relate to, but the other part of it was very difficult to work on. And then as who didn't act the way I wanted to, I mentioned in one of my earliest books, I had a character walk out on me and ended up saving the day for me, but at the time I was really confused.
You know, I like that you talk about finding the right timing to reveal that aspect of their character. And he's strong, but you don't want to reveal that too early. So timing is a big thing, I think, and allowing our characters to be in situations where they can shine, where they can show off their strengths, is important. And obviously, I think that's something that writers do instinctively. They find opportunities for their characters to shine. I was thinking of probably another character in my Hand of Adonai series, and then I'll mention briefly The Bargain, one of the things that I did with that worked out for me. But with the Hand of Adonai series, I had a character who was evil for evil's sake, and Steve really challenged me. He said, no, why is this guy really doing this? What's his motivation? I was like, hey, he wants to take over the world because my guys need somebody to beat. He's like, no, there's got to be more. And he really pushed me, and the more he pushed me, challenged me, encouraged me to seek out the reasoning for this guy's actions. It really I ended up doing like prologues, and the prologues focus on him. It gives a chance to give his perspective on the novel, and you start to understand there's a lot of depth to this character. He's super complex, a lot more than I ever gave him credit for, and I like him a whole lot more. And he's actually one of my favorite characters to write now, because he's constantly doing things that surprise me, and he's constantly doing things that make me sad for the ultimate end that's going to have to come. You know what I'm saying? So it's that's been a lot of fun to do, and a big challenge. With the bargain, I get a lot of comments from readers about the depth of characters that I came up with, and how I could envision these types of things, and where these stories came from. And that was, I don't want to say it was easy, but the setup was fairly easy, because I knew in every story that these characters had, they had a secret. And I knew that going in. I did not know what their secrets were going in, but I knew that every character that I was going to focus on had a secret. And I knew that my main character, my protagonist, also had his share of secrets. And so understanding that is, I think, foundational. I'm going to mention Brett Anthony Johnston again, because it's been at least 15 minutes since I've mentioned his name. So time to get that, check that box. But he's written a great book called Remember Me Like This, and you want to talk about character psychology. This is a book that you absolutely have to read. But one of the things that he taught me when I was in his class was he had us fill out this character sketch sheet. Right, and so we answered questions, basic questions: where were they born, how old are they, tell the story of how they got a scar, all these types of little prompts. And so we were doing these, little disconnected scenes about our characters, and then we got back to class the following session, and he goes, okay, your character lied about one of those things. What did they lie about? Why did they lie about it? And so we started doing more writing. But that simple exercise taught me that as a writer, I don't always know my character's secrets. They still will have secrets even from me. And I think a good writer is one who's going to plumb the depths of the psychology of their characters to figure that kind of stuff out.
Yeah, I entirely agree. I remember, like you said that you were constantly asking your mentees, why are they doing this? I remember my drama teachers doing the same thing to us. What is your motivation? Why are you doing this? This doesn't make sense. Why are you doing this? There must be a reason. But one of the other things they said was, what is their secret? Because everybody has a secret. Doesn't matter who you are. Everybody has secrets. And often you know more about a person by what they're hiding than by what they're exposing. And so even if those secrets never come out in the book, knowing those secrets will impart a richness to the character as a whole, and one of the examples that I currently am in love with for character development is a book called Let Me In. It's a horror novel by John Lindqvist. He's from Sweden, and this book has some of the most really, like, the main character is bullied, but he's not a typical victim, and it's so real to the point where sometimes you have to set the book down because it just feels wrong. And one of the characters is a pedophile, but every good person has bad traits, and every bad person has a good trait. And so you're left feeling so icky because it's so real, and you're feeling, by the end of the book, you feel compassion for everybody, and you're also kind of freaked out by everybody. And but being able to have that kind of dimensionality, that's what my goal is as a writer. When I can do that, when I can make somebody hate my character and not be able to set it down, I know that I have achieved my goals in life, because that is like such intense character development to make a person that real. And so even on a really basic level, I ask myself, what are they hiding? What are their flaws? My main character is a good person. If he's always good all the time, no one's going to like him. He has to have a flaw. Right. What's his flaw? And I think sometimes as new writers we forget that. We want to make our good people all good and our bad people all bad, and there's no overlap. But there's always overlap.
Aaron, Molly has another question. Yeah. He's writes, Aaron, you talked about being frustrated at not hearing your character's voice until the story was almost done. Did that change the rewrite process? Was it harder to to go back and add more content, or easier since you finally knew the voice?
I may be one of the few writers that thinks this way, but I am always very excited to be done with my first draft because I feel like I can start writing.
Mm-hmm.
For me, the first draft is a hurdle. It's an obstacle. It's work. For me, first drafts are work. I enjoy them. It's work I enjoy, but it's rolling up the sleeves, and it's doing like that physical kind of labor that has to be done. If we're thinking about painting, the first draft is the scraping the walls and filling it, putting in the holes and doing all that and taping things off, and nobody enjoys that. But when you start painting and you can actually see color on the wall, you that's when things start to pop. For me, writing begins with draft number 2, and I'm excited by that. I'm energized when I get to the end of the first draft. I'm like, yay, I can finally write my book. So for me, I go into a first draft understanding I don't know my characters. I don't know their psychology, and I probably won't until the end. But when I get to the end, at least for me, the way things work for me, when I get to the end and I know them, then I go, okay, now I can fix it. Does that mean I spend more time in rewrites than do outline writers? Yeah, generally speaking, I do, because I have to write it before I can figure it out. But it is definitely work that I enjoy. For me, it's an energizing process. It does make a lot more, I guess, hours worth of work, but for me, the time goes much, much quicker. I feel a lot more productive. I'll throw in 2 or 3 extra scenes, but more often than not, what I'm doing is cutting scenes out. Cutting the scenes where and this is one other thing I'll say, and I'll let Pops, I'd love to hear what you have to say on this. For me, as a discovery writer, I have a lot of scenes where I'm just trying to figure out what in the world my characters are doing. I'm just trying to get into their heads. And by the time I get to the end and I go back in my revision process and I look at that scene and I go, oh, this was what I was writing to try and figure out why he would do this particular thing or why she would say this particular thing to this particular person. Now that I understand that, the reader doesn't need it and I don't need it. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that. Do you kind of operate in the same way?
I tend to rewrite as I go. But when you were talking, I was thinking of Angie Hunt, the novelist Angie Hunt. Mm-hmm. She used to do it, and I believe she's the one that coined the phrase, the blast copy, where when she would write, she would just sit down and she would write a first draft, and she'd just pour the words out. And the reason she could do that was she knew it wasn't the final copy. She was just getting the story down. So she would be writing along, and then she would come up to an obstacle and say, so something happens here, and the protagonist must figure this out and must somehow say this, and then moves on. And when she gets done, she's at the end. She knows she's got 70% of a book. Then she goes back and she says, okay, now I can go in and do some depth. I can develop my characters because I know what's going to happen now in Act 3. I can go back and now set things up for what's going to happen in Act 3. Then Jack Kavanaugh, whom you know, for a while, he would write the screenplay and then build his book on the screenplay. Because the screenplay has so little information in it, it's got 120, not even full pages for what book writers would consider, but about 120 pages. You get the whole story out. You get the outline. He's a 3-act guy, so he would get that 3-act done, get all the key points in, and then he could go back and start making it from screenplay into a book, and he would add scenes and additional plot lines and stuff like that he'd left out. And that was his way of learning characters and how they would respond.
Now, I have a question for you, Alton, because I'm looking at a situation where, like you, I have a character who is female, and I'm looking at her and I'm saying, you know what, she needs to be a guy. And just the thought of going back and editing and having that big of a change to the entire dynamic of the novel, I'm wondering, how do you tackle a really big core edit?
Same way you eat an elephant, I guess, except that the answer would be it's one scene at a time. One scene at a time. And it can come back and bite you. I have a book out where I change someone's name and I change their basic position in every scene but one. and that's how it was published.
Oh.
Different name. And I got a few letters saying, no, wasn't her name, and I just had to take it on the chin. So those things get missed, and that's after it's gone through, a substantive edit, and it's gone through a line edit, and it's gone through probably 2 or 3 copywriters. No one caught it, and I didn't. So it happens. So it's best to get it right first time. It doesn't work that way all the time, and so sometimes you have to go back and say, okay, now I've learned. And unfortunately, when you're switching gender, when you're switching gender, it's not merely switching up the pronouns because the thinking's a little different. So hopefully you find that problem early on. If you get all the way to the end of the book, then
yeah.
Yeah, cut all those scenes with that person out, and then go insert new ones.
I did that. Just a kind of a funny story. One of my characters was named Kara in the Hand of Adonai series, and I also had a character named Erica. And one of my early readers said, you know what, my alpha reader said, Erica and Kara are kind of too similar of names. I'm getting them confused. Why don't you change one? So I was like, all right, I'm going to change Kara to Lauren. And so those of you who've been reading the Hand of Adonai series online know Lauren. And so I went through and I just did a Control F, right? I'm going to find and replace all instances of Kara with Lauren, except the problem was I had an island that I called Ucara Island, and that was spelled E-U-K-A. So everything became Ulauren Island, and I was like, that's not the same thing. So that was a lot more hunt and find, and that was not the fun editing process. That was not the one that I got excited about. That was the boring one.
Well, yeah, if it makes you feel any better, I just did an edit for someone who he would use the abbreviation for etc., except he spelled it wrong. He had the letters out of order. So I just did a quick search, replace, no biggie. But I didn't think about where ECT, how often it appears in words, connect and
yeah.
So as I go along, I get all these little misspellings, and I'd have to fix them. So yeah, you're not the first. You won't be the last.
The joys of being a writer, we're coming up here on time, but I think another thing that might be worthy of a discussion at some future date would be maybe the psychology of writers, because man, I could talk about that for about 20 years. And probably will be with my therapist. You know what I mean? Like, I'm going to get a therapist. We'll talk for 20 years. But
I don't think it's that big a subject. They're all crazy.
Oh yeah,
that's why we write.
We're all dysfunctional. And I don't want to be fixed because it might ruin my career.
Yeah, exactly. We're all crazy in our own ways. Each family is unhappy in their own way. Each writer is crazy in their own way, I guess. So, before we sign off, any last words or any quick personal promotions you guys want to do?
I just want to say thank you for inviting me. I actually had a lot of fun. I learned a lot from you guys. I never would have imagined being on a podcast with such experienced writers, and being able to hear a little bit about your process and what's made you successful is really awesome as a new writer, and I definitely appreciate it. My website is mayagoode.com. It's just started. It's a brand new author site, and I could use any advice, any tips that anyone may have, but just thank you.
Absolutely. I appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, I'm glad you were here. And last comment on the topic is the writer should have emotional responses to their characters. They should love them or they should hate them.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Or be indifferent if that's what is needed. But if they're not that real to you as a writer, they won't be that real to the reader. So I've had some very coarse conversations with a few of my antagonists. One I said, after he did something, when I told him, I said, well, I was just going to kill you, but now it's really going to hurt. And then caught myself that I thought, well, I need to get up and walk around for a while. But he was that real to me. Yeah, he was that real to me.
Absolutely. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you all for listening. As always, you can find us on First in Fiction or Facebook.com/First in Fiction. You can find me at aarongansky.com and Twitter. If you ever twit us on the Twitter, I don't often twit or tweet. At AD Gansky is my Twitter, and you can at First Sim Fiction. Go ahead and drop us a line, tweet us, and we'd love to hear from you. So until next week, good writing.
Ciao.